science,
engineering,
medicine,
chemistry,
physics,
biology, humanities, cardiology,
entrepreneurship, public health, global
aeronautics, science communication.
Hello everyone, I'm Gareth Mitchell. Welcome along. In this edition, how a cooling blanket can help babies born with brain injuries. Also today, what to look forward to in Mars exploration in the year ahead.
The ExoMars Rosalind Franklin rover will actually drill up to 2 metres into the Martian surface, into those rocks, and extract the core of those rocks and do detailed analysis of these. Even if we don't discover life, we're going to learn lots about the early history of Mars and the climate conditions.
And we're hearing the latest on antimicrobial resistance and some innovative ways to tackle it.
The Imperial College Podcast.
Right, well, as we always do at the top of the podcast, let's start with a couple of news stories from Imperial College. And Kate Whiten, let's start with you. And you have been looking at and you've been reporting on the latest rather worrying evidence about burnout in doctors, haven't you?
Yeah, this is the results of a new survey of 3,000 doctors in the UK who work in the field of obstetrics and gynecology. So these are doctors who deliver babies, who diagnose and treat particular gynecological cancers like cervical cancer, ovarian cancer. And the results from this survey came back and showed that over a third meet the criteria for burnout. And burnout's basically, it's emotional exhaustion, it's triggered by long-term stress, it's associated with depression, there can be a lack of empathy with patients, and also practicing defensively. And this means over-treating, so perhaps recommending treatments or investigations that aren't always necessary, but they're so worried and nervous about getting something wrong. Burnout can also reduce the overall patient safety and the quality of patient care.
Yeah, because the headline I read from your press release was this is 1 in 3 UK doctors working across obstetrics and gynecology. So is it specifically looking at these areas of medicine, or is this across the board?
Exactly. So the research team, who are themselves obstetricians and gynecologists, did look just at this field, but there's a mounting evidence in the UK and also in the US to show that the same feelings and the same rates of burnout are across the board, across all specialities in medicine. This is quite a new field in the UK. It's big in the US, but as I said, there is emerging evidence looking at doctors' well-being and their mental health, because we know it can have a significant impact on patient safety and patient care. And the Imperial research team are calling for further research, but also looking at how we can make hospitals a better working environment for our medical staff at the moment, so better support, better emotional support, and looking at workload as well.
Kate, thank you very much indeed for that. That's Kate Whiten. Also here is Hayley Dunning. And now, Hayley, you're going to bring in some new insights about the sun, aren't you?
Yes, so this is from NASA's Parker Solar Probe. This is a spacecraft that launched in August 2018, and now it's made one of its first close approaches to the sun, has found some fascinating things out about the solar wind. So the solar wind is a stream of charged particles that get thrown out from the sun, and when it gets to Earth, if those winds are angry enough, they can cause some problems. They can interrupt satellites and even electrical grids. So it's really important to understand where that comes from. And now by flying really close, Parker Solar Probe has been able to see the solar wind erupting out of these coronal holes, which is like a magnetic hole in the outer atmosphere of the sun.
How far is this solar probe from the sun itself?
So on this approach, it went to 24 million kilometres, which sounds a long way, but the Earth is usually about 150 million kilometres away, so it's very much closer. And Parker Solar Probe will get progressively closer, up to 6 million kilometres, so it will touch the outer atmosphere of the sun.
What's the Imperial involvement with all this?
So on this NASA probe, we are just helping to interpret the results, but actually in February 2020, the European Space Agency, ESA, will launch a probe called Solar Orbiter, which is also going to look at the sun, and that has Imperial kit on board. So that has a magnetometer that's built by some of our physicists here. And when the two are flying together, they'll actually be able to make incredible measurements of the sun. So Parker Solar Probe will go very close, but that means that it can't carry certain instruments because it will get far too hot for them. So Solar Orbiter will be further out, carrying more sophisticated instruments and telescopes so that together they can really work out what's happening at the sun.
Amazing. Hayley, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, also, whilst you're here in the studio, Hayley Dunning, can you just bring us up to speed with an interview that you did just in the last few days here at Imperial College? And this was looking at brain injury in a certain group of babies in a certain part of the world.
Yeah, so I talked to Stuti Pant, who is a senior research program manager for an incredible set of research projects looking to reduce the effects of baby brain damage in the developing world. I caught up with her at the most recent Imperial Late, and I first asked her, how do babies get brain injuries?
Around the time of birth, there is a presumed lack of oxygen and blood flow to baby's brain due to a certain event, which causes the injury, which is called neonatal encephalopathy. More specifically, it's called hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, and that's the brain injury we work on.
We're here at the Winter Wonder Lab Lates, and I know that your team are presenting here a blanket that actually keeps babies cool. So how does this help?
So this cooling blanket is scientifically called therapeutic hypothermia. As the name suggests, it is hypothermia, which means cooling. When a baby who's born with an injury, a hypoxic ischemic injury, their brain is compromised. Within 6 hours of the birth, we try and cool the babies. What we do is we use a servo-controlled cooling device, which cools the babies for 72 hours on a temperature of 33.5 degrees. After 72 hours, we bring them back by 0.5 degrees per hour. What cooling does is, because it reduces the body's temperature, it reduces the metabolic activity and rates of the baby. It allows a time for the baby's brain to regenerate the damaged cells and also control the severity and permanence of the brain damage, and also prevent more spread of the damage to the cells.
Cooling is the standard of care in the UK, but I understand you're currently testing it in other parts of the world.
We are doing the world's largest trial of cooling on babies in low and middle income countries called the Helix Trial. It stands for Hypothermia for Encephalopathy in Low and Middle Income Countries. The trial is being run in India, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, and we've recruited 408 babies. It's a randomized controlled trial, so babies are either cooled or are given the usual standard care, which is nothing really. And what we are doing is we're going to follow up the babies until 18 months of age to find out whether there are any neurodisabilities. One would wonder, when cooling is a standard first line of treatment here, why are we testing it? Why do we have to invest so much of money trying to test it? But the demographics of high-income countries of the West and the East are so different. The comorbidities, the kind of infections we have are so different. There's rampant malnutrition which affects the fetus's growth and development, and different institutional capacities. You know, the hospitals are not as developed and well equipped by whether it's technology or human resources. So it really deems it necessary to trial it before you actually start treating them. And as of now, there is no proven treatment of neonatal encephalopathy in low and middle income country settings.
You've recently started an incredibly large project in India, one of the largest studies of its kind. So what are you doing out there?
This is one of the largest studies on preventing brain damage during birth. It's called PREVENT, stands for Preventing Epilepsy by Reducing Neonatal Encephalopathy. Now, epilepsy is one of those long-term neurodisabilities as a result of neonatal encephalopathy. Brain injury during birth is one of the causes of epilepsy, and it is preventable. Instead of trying to correct it, we are trying to prevent it. And what we are doing is we are introducing a pragmatic and a generalizable care bundle, which is basically an implementation during the intrapartum care, which is a very small period during labor and during birth and just after birth. But there is so much that could happen during this time, and a very healthy fetus could also be compromised. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to implement 4 very basic key elements. First is a trained birth companion. Then trying to do more acute labor monitoring using an electronic simplified partogram, which is a labor monitoring tool. Third is fetal heart rate monitoring to immediately identify when the fetus is in distress. And fourth is brain-oriented newborn care, which involves resuscitation and early skin-to-skin contact. These are 4 very simple elements, but when they're brought together and implemented, the research says they are supposed to make a very high impact on preventing brain damage during birth.
How large is the study and how long will it run for?
So the study spans over a period of 4 years. In the first year, we're collecting baseline data, basically trying to understand the situation as it is. In the second year, we are implementing the care bundle and we see whether it makes any difference on the outcomes or not. Study is being done in 3 states in South India. 3 major public sector hospitals. Now, if you know, India is the highest population, so we've taken these 3 hospitals which have about 80 to 100 deliveries per day each hospital. So we're hoping to get somewhere around 60 to 70,000 women over 2 years period. It's a significant amount to be able to prove that this care bundle works or not.
Stuti Pant talking there to Hayley Dunning. Well, now let's look ahead to 2020 and specifically Mars. Caroline Brogan has been doing just that, hearing from Imperial's Professor Sanjeev Gupta about not just 1, but 2 Mars missions to look forward to next year. Not only that, but there's plenty going on with an existing mission.
Firstly, we have the Curiosity rover, which I'm on the science team for. We've reached an exciting area that contains lots of clay-bearing minerals. Next year, we have the launch of not 1 but 2 missions to Mars, which will really completely change our understanding of Mars. So firstly, we have the European-Russian rover mission, the ExoMars mission, that will launch between the end of July and August. That's carrying a surface lander and the Rosalind Franklin rover. And this rover has a whole suite of exciting instruments that will really definitely going to search for evidence for life on Mars. And the UK is playing a huge part in this mission. So firstly, the rover has been built in Britain by Airbus. And then we have 2 important UK instruments on board. So firstly, the eyes of the rover, the PanCam instrument, has a big UK team. And that's going to be central because that's what decides where we do experiments on Mars. That's the eyes of the rover. And the second instrument that the UK co-leads is the Raman instrument. That's a Spanish instrument, but co-led by Leicester. And that does geochemical analysis of samples from Mars. And the key difference, say, between Curiosity and ExoMars is that Curiosity drills into the Martian surface, but only drills up to about 5 centimetres, so it's still within the radiation damage zone. So, any organics that might be present are likely to mostly be destroyed. The ExoMars Rosalind Franklin rover will actually drill up to 2 metres into the Martian surface, into those rocks, and extract the core of those rocks and do detailed analysis of these. And it's well below the radiation damage zone, so we've got pristine samples. And secondly, it's going to a place called Oxyoplanum, which is one of the oldest terrains on Mars and rich in clay minerals. And clay minerals are great because they're thought to be good at preserving organics and probably were formed in an ancient watery environment on Mars. But the cool thing is that this terrain is really, really old. It's the oldest terrain we will have visited on Mars, and harkens back to a time that Mars was thought to be once warm and wet. And so even if we don't discover life, we're going to learn lots about the early history of Mars and the climate conditions.
What are these geochemical signals that you'll be looking for?
We really want to understand the chemistry of the rocks we're looking at, because the chemistry of the rocks tells us maybe something about the watery environments at the time. So let's say these rocks were deposited in ancient lakes. It may say something about the chemistry of the lakes at that time. But secondly, you can get alteration of the rocks, and the chemicals can be changed by groundwater flow. And so it'll be telling us about the alteration regime. So it's quite difficult to decipher. This is a set of rocks we've never looked at. Then what we will do with the eyes of the rover is try and work out, by taking photographs of these rocks and looking at structures and features within the rocks, what that ancient environment was like. So what I'm trying to do is paint a picture of the landscape at the time. What did Mars look like? Was it a dry environment? Was it a volcanic environment? Obviously likely to be watery, because that helps us search for life. But no matter what, we'll be able to read a part of Mars's history that we've never been able to read before. Curiosity has detected carbon compounds, organic compounds, relatively simple ones. Those are thought to actually have been delivered by meteorites to the Martian surface. And for us, what was exciting was that we could actually detect organic compounds.
Another rover that's launching in 2020 is Mars rover. Can you tell us some more about that?
The NASA rover, that's another really exciting mission, but it's going to do something very different. This is going to a site on Mars called Jezero Crater that's thought to have been an ancient lake. What this is going to do is the first stage in a very complex process of eventually bringing samples from Mars back to Earth. So what scientists really want is they want to analyse Martian rocks in Earth laboratories, because the sort of tools we have are just extraordinary compared to what you can actually do on Mars. The 2020 rover is the first step in that. It's going to collect and cache samples to be returned to Earth. And so what we have to do as a science team is pick the most expensive geological samples ever collected. So we want samples that may help us discover that there had been microbial life on Mars, but we also want to learn about early Mars history. The earliest records of Earth history are actually lost. We don't have rocks from that period, or the rocks are severely deformed, and so we can't really read early Earth history. Mars is abundant, really old rocks. So getting these samples back will tell us something about the evolution of terrestrial rocky planets and tell us something about ourselves.
Is it the absence of life which has meant early Mars rocks have been preserved better?
No. The key difference is that Earth has a plate tectonic cycle, so the rocks are continuously being recycled, but Mars does not have plate tectonic. They might have had plate tectonics right at the beginning, but then that ceased, and so the surface has always been like it is. So you still have plentiful old rocks preserved which have been destroyed and deformed on Earth.
Do you think, in your heart of hearts, that there was life on Mars?
The rocks we're looking at are kind of from around the time that life originated on Earth. So it would be a little bit surprising if there was something really special about Earth that life didn't originate elsewhere. I'd be surprised if life hadn't arisen on Mars but didn't carry on. So you got a kickstart and didn't carry on. It's really difficult to find evidence for early life on Earth because it doesn't get preserved. So life might have been teeming, but it doesn't get preserved. And so whether that happened on Mars is not clear. But if we don't look, we won't find so.
Lots to look forward to then in the years ahead. That was Sanjeev Gupta talking to Caroline Brogan. Well, Kieran Brophy is in the studio. And finally, Kieran, we're going to talk about antimicrobial resistance. You've been looking into all this. So first of all, set this one up for us. What's the background here?
Thanks, Gareth. Yeah, so I suppose with the discovery of penicillin and antibiotics, it's allowed us in medicine to cure these infections that have been decimating human populations since the dawn of time, really. But just like something out of the film Contagion, where the virus mutates, there's this growing phenomenon, and it's increasingly becoming quite a significant problem, of antimicrobial resistance, which is the idea of no matter how much antibiotics you give a patient or spread on a surface, for example, it just doesn't kill that bacteria or that infection. So to find out more, I went to St. Mary's Hospital and I spoke with Dr. John Otter, who's a senior manager for the Infection Protection and Control Service. And I started by asking John, what can we do as individuals to mitigate our risk of this resistance spreading?
Yeah, so I think that there's definitely things we can do as individuals, and in this country we can take away the risk factors that can cause infections, like drinking too much, smoking, being obese, all become risk factors for general poor health. Infectious diseases prey upon poor health. If we get infected and we go to the GP may well say, you might need antibiotics, but not now. Whereas in times past, they might well have said, not sure about this, I'll give you antibiotics. And we should be aware of that and not go with an expectation for antibiotics. And subtle things like when you finish the course, make sure you give the antibiotic either back to the pharmacy and don't chuck it down the drain. Because if we put antibiotics into the environment, that creates bigger issues.
With our Hollywood screenplay hats on, could you imagine something like a Contagion, where you have a virus, say it adapts, it becomes lethal to humans, and it spreads across the world without us having any defence? Is that plausible?
Kieran, I'm going to show my age now and pull you up on Contagion, because it's not the best ID movie out there. You need to go back to 1995 with Dustin Hoffman and look at Outbreak. Have you seen Outbreak?
Unfortunately, it's before my time, John.
Well, you should get it out. You should buy a VCR player and put it on, because it's brilliant. There's a moment where they realise the transmission route of the virus has changed. It's become airborne. So there's a really important point that the kind of organisms that have this so-called pandemic potential are usually viruses. And viruses are not affected by antibiotics. So they're very different beasts. There's a quote that I picked up that viruses are as different from bacteria as goldfish are from giraffes. They infect other cells and they sort of take over the mechanisms of the cell to produce their own proteins. Whereas bacteria are usually very happy with a symbiotic type of existence. So you mentioned Contagion. It's an infectious diseases movie, and at the end it's got a brilliant reveal, a disease transmission sequence that starts with the poultry farm in Asia, and you see the routes of transmission you had seen through the film all come in at the end in this disease transmission sequence. And there's a mixture of animate surfaces, so people to people, but also inanimate touch surfaces involved in that transmission. And that's true of life. So these antibiotic-resistant bacteria and their virus, fungi, all kinds of other cousins are transmitted by both animate and inanimate surfaces. So we know that contaminated surfaces are important in disease transmission. Historically speaking, in hospital settings, there's been a sense that that's been a very minor player in the overall picture of disease transmission. But data over the past decade or so has turned that on its head and actually suggested that contaminated surfaces are a major player in the transmission of some pathogens, at least some of the time.
So, for example, I'm always conscious in public places, maybe it's just me, of literally grabbing a door handle.
Yeah.
Am I right to think twice whenever I'm literally opening a door in a hospital?
No, I think you're wrong. I'll tell you why. What I'm talking about really is a susceptible patient, debilitated in a hospital setting. That's when contamination of the environmental surfaces can really play a key role in transmission. So the question then becomes, how do we tackle this? We need to make sure cleaning and disinfection when it's needed is tip-top, but cleaning is only ever going to be a point in time. So you can't have continuous cleaning. And yet we know that we shed bacteria and other organisms into the environment constantly. So having a technology that has a background level of activity in reducing the level of contamination is quite appealing as an idea. It's not something that will replace cleaning and disinfection. It's not something that will revolutionise healthcare going forward, but it could be something that's quite widely adopted as a background intervention that could reduce the risk of transmission.
And that was Dr. John Otter.
Kieran, thank you very much indeed for that. Just before I let you go, by the way, if people want to hear more interviews like that, where might they find them?
Yes, Gareth, thank you for the plug. We run a podcast as part of the Institute for Molecular Science and Engineering that's called Never Lick the Spoon. And I get a lot of people asking why it's so called, and it's basically because there's an expression in chemistry. Chemistry is just like cooking, just never lick the spoon. It's available on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, just
like
search.
Everywhere. Excellent. More than happy to give you a plug there, Kieran. It is Christmas after all. That's Kieran Brophy. Do check out his podcast. As for this particular podcast, a quick reminder that you can find us pretty much everywhere as well. We're on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, SoundCloud, and even Entail. You can get visual podcasts over there. Do check that out. I'm Gareth Mitchell saying thank you so much for listening to us this year. We'll be back with more in 2020, of course. So I'll see you then. Happy Christmas and goodbye.